Okay, great. All right, so we're just going to start with a little bit of where we're at. Like, what are CO2 levels in the atmosphere today? And I don't think you as a group are going to be ignorant of this, but I wanted to start with kind of a baseline of where things are at, and some historical perspective on where they've been. And then we're going to start to look further back in time. So where are we today in terms of carbon dioxide levels? So this wonderful website run by NOAA, but with a record that was originally started through measurements by David Keeling through Scripps at Mauna Loa. So that's the observatory in Mauna Loa out in the Pacific, on our Big Island. You can look up what CO2 levels were literally like this morning if you want. And so I went and grabbed this a couple of days ago, and so for the week, I just look at the week because they actually change pretty rapidly on a daily time scale. For the week beginning on May 5th, it was 426.92 parts per million. And so if you go back a year ago, it was 424, and 10 years ago on that same week, it was 401. And so this is the recent record here on the bottom. It shows time and years on the x-axis going from 2020 to 2024, and the y-axis is CO2 concentration. So the red is the measurements, and then the black line is kind of a smooth, like smooths out the annual variations. And so you see a couple things in there. The first is that the red line goes up and down and up and down, and that's the Earth breathing in and out. That's the, you guys hear me still? That's the biosphere, Earth's biosphere breathing in and out. So as spring comes in the Northern Hemisphere, while the plants start to breathe in carbon dioxide levels start to go down. And then as the fall comes and those plants die and the leaves start to decompose, the microbes that are eating those plant materials start to respire and they put CO2 back in the atmosphere. That's the Earth breathing back out. So we see these ups and downs, these swings on annual timescales, and that's the biosphere responding to sunlight. But the longer term trend here, you see that each year those cycles get higher and higher, right? And so that's the increasing trend of atmospheric CO2 in the atmosphere. And that's not from any kind of biosphere thing, that's from our activities. If we look on longer time scales, so this beautiful record, this is an amazing record, and you as academics will understand how hard it is to keep something going long term, right? To be able to make an incredibly difficult and accurate measurement over a long time period. And that's what David Keeling did. He fought for it. We had to save it many times over many years to continue this long-term record, but it's been continuously measured all the way since the late 50s, and it shows us what the atmospheric concentrations of CO2 are doing over that time period. And so we can see since 1960 that CO2 has been steadily rising in the atmosphere, and that's due to human anthropogenic activities. You continue to see that up and down, the breathing in and out, but it's superimposed on this long-term trend of increasing CO2 from human activities. And so, I can put my birth year on that. So you can, maybe some of you can, some of you can't, I don't know, but you can start to think about how much carbon dioxide has changed in your lifetime. And I teach, Oceans ADB, it's Our Changing Planet. We talk about climate change. Every year, it's not a class that I can just like pick the slides up, because every year, everything's changed about what the climate has done and what the atmospheric CO2 has done, and what human emissions have done. So I have to update it every year because this is constantly evolving and changing. We can see that here. Why is CO2 is rising? That's because of human emissions, mostly from burning fossil fuels, also some land use change effects, and from cement. Cement is another, the other kind of major source of CO2 to the atmosphere. And so this is the record we have of direct measurements of taking samples out of the atmosphere and measuring CO2 concentrations. And so we can see that nowhere in this record are there CO2 levels that look like they do today. There's no place that has 426 parts per million. And so that starts, as a geologist, you start to ask the question, well, when were CO2 levels that high, if ever? And so we can start by looking at CO2 levels that are still measured on gases that came from the atmosphere that were trapped in ice cores. So ice in ice sheets. So ice sheets, snow falls on ice sheets, and you get little, holes. The snow's fluffy, full of air. Over time, the accumulating snow compresses all the snow underneath it, and it forms ice. And it encapsulates those bubbles, those little samples of the atmosphere, and you can actually extract those and measure the CO2 concentration. And so when you do that, you can measure CO2 concentrations going back, this goes back to the 1700s, and you can see that nowhere in that period the CO2 levels look like they are today. So that makes sense in our understanding of anthropogenic CO2, but it still shows us that they've just been continuously rising, both primarily starting during the Industrial Revolution when we really started to burn fossil fuels in earnest, but even before that, due to some other land use changes and some burning of other fuels, biofuels. Okay, so this is still kind of human history, right? But these ice cores go back even further. And so the deepest ice core, the longest, oldest ice core, so the deepest, is in Antarctica, in kind of this desolate place called Vostok. And that ice core has bubbles in it that go back hundreds of thousands of years. The ice in there gives us samples of the atmosphere going back almost 800,000 years. And so if you look at the record of CO2 going back that far, again, no time do we see CO2 levels that look like today. We see, swings up and down, and there's a whole interesting, huge part of my field in terms of paleoclimate to understand those swings. But the short answer is that they're actually driven, they're ice ages, coming and going of ice ages that have been driven by small changes in Earth's orbit, natural changes due to the precession of the spin axis, the tilt of the spin axis, and how oval or circular, the eccentricity of the orbit, right? So those are all, Milankovitch was the one that first kind of made these calculations and figured out that there was some pacing of these ice ages due to orbital changes. These are all natural changes, and in fact, CO2 here is acting as an amplifier of those insulation changes to drive the ice ages. But here again, we see no levels that look like they are today. And so, this kind of begs the question again, what does a high CO2 world look like? The world we're in today and the world of our future. And the future, remains an open question. So these are different projections going on into the future, going up to 2100, of CO2 levels in the atmosphere, given different scenarios. These RCPs are the IPCC, the international body that puts together these reports, different ways of thinking about what we humans are going to do, right? So the range of things we see there are, none of them are written in stone. And the uncertainty, if you take that as a range, that's all uncertainty about what humans are going to do. Those are different projections for how much fossil fuels humans are going to burn and how fast we're going to burn them. And so, we are currently not on that highest trend, but we're certainly not on the lowest trend either. And so what are the consequences of these different CO2 concentrations, both what we see today and what we could potentially see in the future? Even in a moderate scenario, there are going to be levels that are higher than today. So that's kind of the question, the kind of driving question here for my research and what I hope to present in this talk. And the last point I want to bring up is that, the way we understand Earth's temperature as a response to greenhouse gases, it's not a linear function, but it's a very predictable function. It has a relationship. It's the log of CO2 concentrations that determines the radiative forcing, the amount of energy that the greenhouse gas is trapped and the amount that the Earth needs to heat up to get rid of that energy, just to maintain energy balance. So we understand that quite well. What we don't understand are things like tipping points. And so there's the idea of a tipping point is something where you reach a threshold and then the change accelerates, the rate of change accelerates. And it may be something that's recoverable, maybe something if you pull back on the forcing, you can pull back on the response, but it may be something that is irreversible, at least over some time scale. And so the diagram on the bottom is meant to show this forcing and response where you have some forcing, think of it as CO2, and the response, it drops a bit. It's not quite linear, it's somewhat linear, but it could drop really much faster than the forcing is causing it, is driving it. That would be a positive feedback, a tipping point. But it might come back once you remove the forcing, right? That would be a recoverable perturbation, whatever you want to call something that dramatic on Earth. But then the bottom line there shows what an irreversible change would be. And this is at least irreversible on whatever time scale is represented by this graph. And it shows a change that is not recoverable over any time scale if you just remove that forcing. So if you think of it, we just brought CO2 levels back down to the levels they are today or the levels they were before kind of industrial activity started raising them, we wouldn't necessarily return back to normal situation that we saw. And so there's examples, there are things in the climate system that are thought to behave like this, particularly things like ice sheets, where once you melt them, they're very hard to grow back. It takes both a long time, and you have to, the temperature and the CO2 levels where you melt them is very different from the CO2 levels and temperature where you can start to grow them again. So these are the kinds of things we're worried about, in addition to just the basic thing we understand about the relationship between temperature and greenhouse gases on Earth. And so the motivation for my research and what I want to convey to you today, first is that CO2 is rising. We can measure it, and we see the Earth's temperature response rising in ways that we understand, that are predictable based on radiation transfer, atmospheric physics, all these kinds of things, right? But the future, today's CO2 levels and future CO2 levels and the temperatures that would accompany them without any of these feedbacks are far outside of anything we've ever measured as humans and experienced even in our evolution. And so how certain are we that our models of the future are predicting temperatures, climates, things that are accurate? And what do these high CO2 worlds that we're going to see in the future look like? Even if we stopped emissions now, CO2 levels would maintain, or sorry, temperatures would maintain at about the same level, and CO2 levels would not begin to fall appreciably rapidly. So we're already outside of any kind of CO2 levels that we have made measurements of. And so the kind of the thrust of my research in paleoceanography and paleoclimate in general is to use the past as a guide to our future, to look at the geologic record, the archaeological record, all kinds of fossilized clues to what the Earth looked like in the past, and understand those clues and what they tell us about the what caused the changes we see and what that kind of portends or tells us about our future. And so that's the overall motivation for my research. And so the talk today is going to be focused on geologically what is kind of recent time. So the past 65 million years, the dinosaurs died off at 65 million years, and we're going to go up to the present. Geologically, that's a blink of an eye still. Earth's history goes back, 4,500 million years. And so there's lots of other interesting events in Earth history and lots of things to study. But this is a time period where the Earth is more similar to today than any of those earlier time periods. And so in terms of the configuration of the continents, where North America was, that we have an Atlantic Ocean, all those kinds of things are existed throughout the 65 million years. And largely, but not exclusively, the kinds of plants and ecosystems on biota that existed at 65 million years, just post 65 million years after the impact, exist today, with a few exceptions, which I'll highlight. So we're going to take a little tour of the Cenozoic era, this time period, and see some of the how different periods of it were, some of the changes that occurred. And then we're going to go back and talk about how we can actually reconstruct CO2 in the past when we don't have samples of the atmosphere, and look at what the records of CO2 constructed in these different ways tell us about this history. So the Cenozoic era, it's defined, the geologists are, sticklers on precision and stratigraphy. So it's defined as a particular layer and an outcrop in Italy that records the asteroid impact that killed off the dinosaurs and began the stratigraphic era that is the Cenozoic, and the date of that is about 65 million years. And it continues through these different geologic periods, so the Eocene, Oligocene, Miocene, and Pliocene, and then comes up to the present here. And so we're just going to start at the beginning of the Cenozoic, and so this is where I get to show the exciting geology here, the Cretaceous geography. So this is what the Earth looked like, where the continents were, and how big the oceans were at the time of the impact of the dinosaurs. So you can see, the basic ocean configurations are similar today, but for instance, the Atlantic Ocean was much smaller. It's been getting bigger since then, actually since much before then. The Pacific was huge and has been shrinking due to subduction and other great geologic processes. And there was an ocean that extended across at the equator through what is now the Mediterranean and things like that. The Mediterranean is kind of the last vestige of that ocean there. And so the asteroid hit in what is now the Yucatan Peninsula. And so there's a huge impact crater there. And in fact, scientists have drilled into that crater and studied the sediments that exist there. There's a wonderful, wonderful paper that came out of that. It's called The First Day of the Cenozoic, because they actually have sediments that sit right on top of the impact layer. And so it's really the record of the first time period after this impact and the beginning of this new era. This is an artist rendering of the kind of I put post-impact, I originally said post-apocalyptic, but we were in a pretty bleak time to live. And in fact, it was a horrible time for many organisms to live because many of them didn't make it. Many species, lineages, genera died off due to the impact, and it really depended on their dependence on sunlight. So a lot of the photosynthetic organisms, there was the shading from the impact lasted for years, and so essentially shut down or shut off photosynthesis on land and in the world's oceans. And so organisms that depended on eating that photosynthetic material, leaves or algae that was fresh, died off, or many of them did. But those that could kind of survive on detritus, things that have energy in it, but it was stored energy, like, you know, roots in the soil or things like that, were more likely to survive. It killed off the dinosaurs, and it also opened up kind of ecological niches that led to the rise of mammals. And so without this impact, we might not be walking around this landscape today, and some other life form might be holding an Emeriti luncheon. So the consequences of the impact were profound and really reshaped the biology and the lineages we see today. But the recovery geologically was relatively rapid, and so it took thousands of years for kind of productivity to come back in the ocean with weedy species and things like that, and millions of years to kind of recover for new organisms to evolve to fill the ecological niches that were available, and great places to live as long as you could figure out how to do it. But within 5 million years or more, there was flourishing ecosystems, things like that, and it was a time of great warmth. And so if you go back 60 million years ago, this now shows the continental configuration at that time. And there was great warmth. There was no ice caps at all. There was no Antarctic ice sheet. The bottom right shows a fossilized flowering plant from Antarctica. And so there was, I don't know if it would still get cold in the winter. There's still no sunlight, but it was a vegetated landscape in Antarctica, and in the high Arctic there was palm trees growing there, crocodilians who would stay in the kind of warmer parts of the Arctic. But it was a really different time period and a really warm time period. One of my favorite kind of anecdotes about that time period is what high temperatures allowed different organisms to do. And so cold-blooded animals like snakes are limited by how much they can kind of gain heat to kind of warm their chemistry up and get going and be able to move around. So it's really warm, and they get that energy through their surface, right? The surface, whereas their volume is what they have to heat up. And so when it's cold, you want a kind of high surface area to volume ratio. You want to be able to take lots of heat to warm your body up. When it's warm, you can get lots of heat, so you can go really big. So here's what an artist rendition of what the kind of snakes and turtles and other things would have looked like at this time, at least in some parts of the world. So these are based on skeletons from South America, the tropics during that time. And so in the front here is Titanoboa. And so this is a snake that would have been about 42 feet long, weighed about 1,500 pounds. Wouldn't want to meet that in a back alley or any alley. And the kind of closest living relative is a boa constrictor. And so the comparative size of the vertebrae, the fossils that are preserved from this, are shown on the bottom right. So the Titanoboa on the right, and then the nearest living relative on the left there. And so you can just see, just based on the bone size, how different those organisms were. In the background, that turtle right there, the shells is a beautiful quarry where a lot of these fossils come from. And the shells for that turtle are literally this big. So really incredible. So we had this kind of great warmth 60 million years ago, and that continued for quite some time. Millions and millions of years, and kind of talk about that temperature history in a few minutes. One of the other interesting things, that I didn't know about until I became a geologist and started studying Earth history, is that the ecosystems, the grasslands and savannas that we think of today are actually very recent geologically. And so this shows a map of the current extent of grasslands, which are kind of these mid-latitude temperate ecosystems, and savannas, which are these tropical or subtropical grass-dominated ecosystems. And I've also shown the charismatic megafauna that inhabit these for enjoyment here. So we've got bison and elephants here. But these ecosystems didn't exist at all at the beginning of the Cenozoic. And so these kind of iconic features of Earth's surface today really only evolved during kind of the past 30 to 35 million years, and really rose to prominence much more recently over the past kind of 5 to 10 million years. So it's another kind of major change that's occurred over the Cenozoic. And if we kind of zoom forward, we're going to go back into the Cenozoic, but we'll talk more about it, but just how different today is from most of the Cenozoic. And so today we actually live in what we would consider a modern ice house. This shows the continental configuration today, or actually the continental configuration and ice sheets as they existed about 20,000 years ago. And so we went from this period of greenhouse conditions with no ice sheets at either poles to having a permanent ice sheet in Antarctica, permanent or near somewhat permanent ice sheet in Greenland, and a regularly appearing ice sheet that covers northern North America, northern Europe, and other places like that. And so, in fact, most of the last 2.5 million years has not looked like today. It's looked like this. It's had massive ice sheets on Earth. So we actually live in a toasty, warm period of the Pleistocene, the latest part of the Cenozoic. And this is, wanted to put some other pictures up. This is me collecting an ice core in Antarctica. I was involved in the study looking at some of the gases in these ice cores and what they tell you about CO2 history. And so there we're drilling down to get these ice cores. So you need ice sheets to do that. Okay, so these are kind of vignettes going through the Cenozoic. And so I just kind of want to put that in context. So this is a record going again from 65 million years to present, but now I put on something that's basically a measure of the temperature of Earth over time. And it's related to the isotopes of these little organisms that live in the bottom of the ocean. And this is seminal work that is been lifelong work by fellow Emeriti, Jim Zachos, in the Earth and Planetary Sciences Department. And so this record kind of puts into context these changes that I've shown. So we see this warm greenhouse period with these large, snakes and all this kind of stuff. We see with temperatures that are amazingly different from today. So average global temperature is 12 degrees different from today. And then you see kind of a peak in temperature there, and then a slow descent through kind of the middle of the Cenozoic, and then this sharp kind of abrupt drop. And that is one of the major transitions in the Cenozoic, and that is when the Antarctic ice sheet first grew. We first had a permanent large ice sheet on Antarctica. In fact, it appears that it's been there ever since. During post that period, we had the expansion of grasslands and savanna a bit later, and then we have this modern ice house, this cold period towards the end here. So this is kind of the geologic history we see of Earth's temperature and Earth's ecosystems and Earth's ice sheets. But it kind of begs the question, how much of this is related to CO2? Are there other processes we don't understand or thresholds we don't know about that we need to understand? Or is this really all just driven by CO2? We've got everything in hand. And how well, if we can reconstruct CO2, how well can we predict these past time periods with the same models that we're using to predict our future changes, right? So can we test those models? So we're going to turn now to kind of how you actually reconstruct CO2 from the geologic record where you don't have bubbles to go look at. And I'm going to talk specifically about a method that I use and have been working on extensively, but we're going to kind of come back to a record of CO2 that incorporates lots of different methods to kind of create a more robust long-term record of CO2 and examine that in the context of this Cenozoic history. So first of all, reconstructing CO2 is, unless you have a bubble of air, is a really hard problem because it's not usually the direct effect chemically or physiologically on organisms or the processes that are kind of potentially recording how high CO2 concentrations are. So you kind of have to tease it apart, figure it out from these other processes. And there's lots of really innovative ways that people have thought about doing that, figured out how to do that. And so this is just a little matrix here of different methods. Most of them are rooted in how plants, either land plants or marine algae respond to the CO2 environment that they're living in. Because CO2 is the essential nutrient for life, if you think about it. We need other things, we need nitrate, phosphate, things like that. But at its most basic, we need carbon to build the molecules that make up our cells. And so that CO2 is the source for those biomolecules. And so as this essential nutrient, cells are very interested in getting enough and very attuned to how much CO2 there is available for them to grow. And so the method that I work on most is related to marine phytoplankton and how they acquire CO2 and fix it or take it up and make their biomolecules. So the basic idea for what we do is, well, it's that what we want to know is the atmospheric concentration of CO2. That's what determines the radiative balance of the Earth and Earth's temperature and things like that. And so land plants are directly sampling that atmosphere, but they have also, other competing demands on them. Same is true for phytoplankton in the ocean. But the link between the atmosphere and the ocean comes about just through the chemical equilibria of CO2 concentrations between the atmosphere and ocean. So Henry's constant for the chemists or chemistry aficionados out there just relates the concentration of CO2, the equilibrium concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere to that of the surface ocean. And so if you go to the right place in the ocean, the seawater CO2 concentration, the dissolved CO2 concentration is proportional to the atmospheric CO2 concentration. And so if you know that right place, and we have different ways of figuring that out, you can go find the CO2 concentration in the ocean, and that can tell you about the atmosphere. The second part of the story is then how the marine algal cells record how much, sense and record how much CO2 is in the water. And so the way that that is expressed in the way that we kind of examine it is through how they fractionate the isotopes of carbon. So I'll talk a little bit about that. But the idea is that you have these marine algal cells growing in seawater. They're taking up CO2 from their surrounding environment. They're sensing or depending on the external concentration for how much they take up. So that how much they take up depends on how much CO2 is in their environment. And then that internal CO2 that's in the cell gets fixed into organic matter, all the biomolecules that make up that cell. So we're going to do a little quick detour into carbon isotopes, just so we know what those are and we're on the same page, and we'll come back to how the carbon isotopes behave during this step and how they reflect CO2 concentrations. So carbon isotopes in nature, there's two stable isotopes, carbon-12, which is the most abundant one, and carbon-13, which is rarer, but actually not super rare. It's 1.1% of all carbon. And then carbon-14 is a radioactive element of carbon that's produced in the atmosphere from cosmic rays and decays pretty quickly. And so it's not one we can use to do anything with on these long time scales. By the time we get to a fossil, that is decayed away. And so the carbon-12 and carbon-13, they both have the same valence electron structure, so they both participate in the same chemistry, but they have slightly different masses. And so that affects the rates that they can do things a little bit, not a huge amount, but a little bit. And so because of those slightly different rates, so the ratio, how much carbon-13 to carbon-12 you have in, say, the cell that is made from that CO2 is slightly different from the CO2. It's because of the different rates of uptake and fixation of that carbon into the cell. And so we can use that. That provides a beautiful little key, little hook into understanding how carbon is getting taken up by these marine algal cells and fixed into CO2. And we'll see that it fixed into organic carbon. We'll see that it depends on how much CO2 there is in their environment. So here's just a quick, not even a cell. This is just the enzyme that first takes CO2 and converts it into a molecule that's then used to make all other molecules in a cell. So the enzyme is Rubisco. But it's the primary step where this fractionation, this difference in the rates that carbon-13 and carbon-12 react occurs. And so if there's lots of CO2 available, the enzyme can be choosy. And so it chooses C13. C12. It takes up more C12, carbon-12, or CO2 with carbon-12 in it, reacts more quickly with this enzyme. And so the product, the organic matter, is more negative in this delta C13 space. It just means that it has less carbon-13 and more carbon-12 in it. So it can be choosy when there's lots of CO2 around. And so the way the biologists and others measure this fractionation, this difference between the substrate, the CO2 that the cell takes up, and the organic matter that's fixed by the enzyme, is this little epsilon p value here. It's just the difference in those C13 concentrations, if you will. And so when there's lots of CO2, epsilon p is a big number. There's a large fractionation. If, however, CO2, there's not a lot of CO2 around the cell, there's not a lot of CO2 diffusing into the cell, and the cell can't afford to be as choosy. And so it's going to take more of the CO2 that comes into the cell and fix it into that organic matter. And when it does that, just kind of by mass balance, it doesn't get to express that whole fractionation. So this epsilon p value gets smaller. And so the key thing here is that when this epsilon p value, this fractionation is big, CO2 levels are high. And with epsilon p value is small, CO2 levels are low. And so if we go back to our little diagram here, we put this relationship on, we now have a way of tracking the CO2 concentration that was in the seawater when a marine algae is growing. By if we can measure this epsilon p, this carbon isotope fractionation between the CO2 source that the algae is taking up and the actual biomass, their cell carbon isotope or carbon-13 concentration, and it has this relationship between 1 over the CO2 concentration. So this brings us into, so that's great. If you go out, you could go filter algae out of the ocean offshore here today, and you could make these measurements. You could measure the CO2 from the water, you could measure the algal cell, and you could calculate EP and reconstruct CO2, but we already know CO2 today, right? So we want to do this in the geologic past. And so what we need is a way to get at the carbon isotope composition of that algal cell and the carbon isotope composition of the CO2 the cell is taking up, because that can change as well for other reasons. And so this brings us to my particular area of work, which is using molecular fossils to look at the history of life and all these different processes on Earth over geologic time periods. And so you guys, the typical fossil, if I say fossil, people think of, seashells, the whale skeleton down at the Seymour Center. Maybe if you had looked under a microscope at marine sediments, you'd think of, smaller shells, but they're all inorganic materials, so calcium carbonate typically, or opal, silicon shells. And that's only, those are not even actually the living parts of organisms. And so all the other parts of an organism are the soft tissues, the things that typically don't kind of preserve as an identifiable object. Sometimes they do, and that's super interesting. But what does often get preserved are the molecules that make up those cells. And so the term that's used for those are molecular fossils or biomarkers, not in the kind of medical sense, but in this geologic sense, where you can, what I do in my lab is we actually take sediments from the ocean or land or whatnot, we extract these molecules and identify them. We can look at, there's kind of this amazing diversity of structures that these molecules have, and we can actually link those to particular groups of organisms. So we can look at these molecules in the sediments and the distribution of them, and it tells us about what organisms were there. And importantly, the carbon, the backbone of these molecules is made out of carbon. It's part of the same carbon that that whole cell was made out of. And so the carbon in those molecules records this carbon-13 to carbon-12 ratio of the algae if you have the right molecule. And so the way we go about this then is these kind of two long molecules here are these long chain alkanones, they're called, that are specifically from this group of marine algae, the cockroachophores, which is a picture in the upper right, and that was the micrograph that was on the title slide as well. And so what we do to actually measure this carbon isotope fractionation is we go to ocean sediments and we do two things. Just the way we go about this is we use these molecules, these biomarkers from the marine algae, and we measure their carbon isotope values, and that tells us the carbon isotope values, the C13 concentrations of the algae. And then we go to these fossil shells of calcium carbonate, this inorganic carbon from foraminifera, so a group that paleoceanographers use a lot. And the carbonate, the ion that's in that shell, comes from the CO2 that's in seawater. So we can measure the carbonate C13 concentration in that shell on the right. And that tells us about the C13 in the seawater, the C13 of the CO2 in the seawater. And the difference between those two numbers is this photosynthetic carbon isotope fractionation. So now we have a way of going to sediments, to any sediment that, from millions of years ago, and we can actually measure things that tell us about this carbon isotope fractionation. We can relate that back to CO2 concentrations. And so I thought I'd put in just a little plug for how we actually get those sediments, because that's a big part of our field. And so this is the scientific ocean drilling vessel with JOIDES resolution that actually goes and gets the sediments from the seafloor. So these are, kilometers below the ocean surface, and then the sediments themselves are, hundreds to 1,000 meters below the seafloor. So it requires actually drilling down into the seafloor. And so this is the drilling vessel that is currently run by the US, and it's part of an international program that goes and drills these amazing sediment cores throughout the world's oceans. That gives us access to these ancient sediments that lets us do these kinds of studies. Those cores come up, and this is a core. These are a series of cores that have been split open, so you can see different layers in there. And so we take samples out of those cores, and we bring them back to the lab here, and we do our analysis. And so this is just some pictures of what we actually do in my lab. So this is a student breaking up that sediment. We want to clean off the surface in case somebody with, say, sunscreen or any other kinds of things has touched it. And we only want the molecules that come from the seafloor, from the ancient life, not anything from that could have been introduced today. And then we extract the molecules. It's kind of like a fancy espresso machine, basically. It uses hot solvents and dissolves these molecules out of the sediment. And then we end up actually with a really complicated mixture. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of molecules in there. So it's much too complicated for us to analyze. And so we do some purification chemistry to isolate groups of compounds at least. And then we actually do kind of further separation, but based on gas chromatography, where we inject the samples into a gas chromatograph. They're carried through this long column with helium. And because they migrate through that column at different rates, different molecules elute or come out at different times. And so the bottom right shows chromatograms where time is going on the x-axis and response is on the y-axis. And each of those peaks there is a different molecule that was in those sediments. And those peaks that are shown there, those are two different chromatograms. Those are the peaks that we're looking for. These are these long chain alkanoids that come from the algae that we want to study. And so that just tells you how much is there. But we actually, in the lab at UCSC, we have the ability to couple this separation with an isotope ratio mass spectrometer. So we can actually measure how much carbon-13 is in those molecules relative to carbon-12. And that gives us the number we need to know. Okay, so if we do this, and so now I've made, and many other people have made lots of these measurements over geologic time. And so we actually have a record of CO2 from these alkanoids, from these long chain molecules going back about 45 million years. And then that's one way of getting at CO2. And there's issues associated with that. It's kind of part of my active area of research, but definitely does tell you about CO2. But these other methods, by combining them all together, we can actually kind of use what we call a multi-proxy, or multiple approaches to get at CO2 that are not dependent, they don't have the same errors, right? So by averaging them together, putting them together, we actually get a much better, more robust estimate of CO2. And so that's what I'm going to focus on for the rest of the talk. Is this record is part of a project that I was on that, I'm getting the time signal, I get it, that reconstructed CO2 from all these different proxies. And so we're just going to kind of walk through that, and then we'll finish up. So, so this is the record. This shows, the blue line shows CO2 declining over the Cenozoic, over this time period. And so during this kind of extraordinary warmth we saw early in the Cenozoic, we see CO2 levels were high. In fact, like 1,000 parts per million or more. So much higher than we see today, and perhaps higher than we'll see depending on what we do in the future. One immediate question you can ask is, when was the last time CO2 levels were as high as they are today? And so we did that. And so the last time there's even a 50% probability that they were higher today was about 14 to 15 million years ago. And so that's today, really 2024. And if we examine this CO2 history in relation to temperature over the same time period, we see that there's a very close correspondence in the fact that CO2 levels change, or temperatures change nearly in lockstep with CO2 levels. And so this indicates to us that in large part of these changes are driven by greenhouse gases. And in fact, the way we think about greenhouse gases and their effect on climate is largely correct. The sensitivity that we see of greenhouse gases to temperature follows the relationships we understand from physics and chemistry. There's no surprises that we know of. There are some surprises though in terms of these thresholds. So if we look at the record of the cryosphere of ice sheets, we see that the initiation of the Antarctic ice sheet about 34 million years ago occurred at CO2 levels that are about 700 parts per million or so. And so levels that we might see in the near future. And that was apparently irreversible effect, at least with CO2 levels and temperatures that have existed since that time period. And the last thing is we see that these major ecosystem transitions that occurred over this time period, less strongly coupled to CO2, but probably to temperature and its effects on rainfall and things like that. But those changes have driven the evolution of and origination and expansion of grasslands. And so I'm just going to conclude. I just want to, the observations from this record and what we can see from it is that the last time we saw levels like today were about 14, 15 million years ago. The temperature changes are consistent with greenhouse gas forcing. They actually follow the relationships we understand. There are thresholds that exist in the climate system. And the take-home message really is that the worlds we see with these high CO2 worlds are really different from today. And that getting to those worlds is going to be painful for humans. It's going to be a difficult transition if we don't actually eliminate greenhouse gas emissions and potentially avoid some of these irreversible effects like melting of the ice sheets. And so I just leave you with this question. Are humans going to be a fast or slow feedback on this problem on CO2? Are we going to respond quickly and stop emitting CO2 so that we actually limit the amount of warming, or will it be a slow feedback and it takes us a long time to get going and reduce our CO2 emissions? Thus, we're going to see much higher CO2 levels and higher temperatures. And so I'll finish with this kind of fun. This is a climate stripes plot of the last 65 million years. It shows the temperature evolution superimposed on top, underneath the CO2 record that we developed. So I'll leave it there and I'm happy to take any questions.
Share screen again so that you are visible.
Is there any questions?
It doesn't have your got it. Start your
Go.
So, do we know what caused the big rise in CO2 about 53 million years ago? And where did all that CO2 go on? It isn't in fossil stuff. The fossil fuels came from much longer ago. So where did all the CO2 go that was in the atmosphere 53 million years ago and is now not in the atmosphere?
Great question. So yeah, so the question was, why were CO2 levels so high, like 55 million years ago, and where has all that CO2 gone since then, carbon gone since then? And so the answer for the first part is that the higher CO2 levels were probably caused by higher rates of volcanism, which is the long-term source of CO2 in the atmosphere. And the Earth responds to that by increasing temperatures till the chemical weathering, the dissolution of rocks that neutralizes that carbon and buries it in the ocean, came into equilibrium with those higher rates of CO2 of volcanism. And so, and where it's gone is into the ocean. So over long time periods, that's the ultimate fate of all carbon that goes in the atmosphere. And that includes the carbon we're adding today. So in hundreds of thousands of years and millions of years, we're going to see this thick layer of calcium carbonate on the seafloor. That's all the carbon that we put there.
So it wouldn't go all into the ocean because that's when at the same time that forests, gymnosperms and angiosperms evolved to form the current boreal forests and the tropical forests. I mean, all that was starting up after the demise of the dinosaurs.
Fair enough. Yeah. So the comment was that some of that carbon ended up in the terrestrial biosphere, and it did, but it's only on these kind of timescales. It's there's a transient uptake into the biosphere, but then you have to kind of bury it on land to have that kind of be a persistent sink. And so there is some burial on land, and there are some fossil fuels that come from the last 65 million years, but the majority of it has ended up as calcium carbonate and some organic matter in the ocean. Yeah.
As I understand this, it's a rate problem for us. I mean, the Earth has been warmer and more CO2 in the past, but it took many years to get there. Am I right? And do we know the difference of the rate of warming today versus how quickly it got to 1,000 parts?
It's kind of a both problem, right? So, but the rates are unlike anything in the geologic record. Even, I didn't talk about it, but one of Jim Zakos's principal areas of research was this time period of the Paleocene thermal maximum, about 55 million years ago, where there was a natural kind of experiment where there's a really geologically rapid release of CO2, a transient rise in CO2 like we're seeing today. But it was over thousands of years and not over, decades to a century. And so but from that time period, there's many lessons we've learned. And so the rates do matter. And so at quick rates of CO2 release, we see things like this ocean acidification, whereas the slow geologic rates of CO2 change that we mostly talked about here don't actually lead to ocean acidification. So and the rates that, animals and plants can migrate and things like that depend on rates as well. So there's no direct analog in this time period for what we're doing today, both because of rates and perhaps because of levels.
Roger?
Yeah, my question is similar to that of Barry's, and that is the question of the rates, the transient effects. I mean, you've got a total nightmare here of different timescales you're working with. And even the question of diffusion of CO2 through the water is a problem. Simple questions like what's the diffusion, convection that drives the mixing of the atmosphere over various times. So it comes to general question about, I'm interested in what information there is in the transient time-dependent part of the CO2 concentrations. Now, is that modulation increasing with time? Because it does reflect things like forestation. How does it affect, do you get the same sort of effect in very covered Amazon rainforest versus grasslands? And it's just a kind of a question, what happens if you look at those modulations? Is there some information there?
Yeah, so the question of rates is a good one. It's kind of woven through this. I didn't really go into it a lot, but one of the ways we can study rates on shorter timescales is by looking in the recent past, where we have these CO2 concentrations that have changed over ice ages, right? So those are kind of thousands to tens of thousands of years. And so we do see on those timescales that things like the geologic weathering of materials isn't at play. And it's really just redistribution of carbon between the biosphere, the land biosphere, soils, and the ocean. And so those CO2 changes are largely driven by this redistribution. And so we can learn a lot about the rates that CO2 can get out of the biosphere, the rates that it can actually be taken up by the ocean, and how much carbon can be stored in the ocean, at least over some time periods. So we can use other parts of the record that I didn't really talk about to get at the kind of time-dependent parts of the carbon cycle that are at play, right? So some parts of the carbon cycle will be very active and respond very quickly to temperature, CO2 changes, and other parts will respond very slowly. What we're seeing here with a 65 million year record are all of those together, right? Both the slow responses and the fast responses. The coming decades, we're going to mostly care about the fast responses.
Jim.
Yeah. So there's two big inflections in there, one at 15, one at 5. Are those tipping points? And if so, what are they?
They are, so the 15 million year one looks like it's related, another change in volcanism, specifically seafloor splitting rates and subduction related volcanism. There's some kind of recent work that went back and really carefully looked at I'm going to say some words because he's going to understand the geometric polarity timescale on very fine detail over this time period, and looked at the rate changes over kind of millions of years. And so it looks like there's actually some changes that might partially explain some of that. The drop at 2.6 comes about because of the way we've made this curve. So this is a long-term average. And so it's averaging out the glacials and interglacials. And that's when we start to get the glacials, the low sea levels and interglacials.
Climate change is being driven by burning fossil fuels. The reason we have fossil fuels is that during the Carboniferous, all those trees fell into, because the earth was very wet at that time. that they fell into the water and got buried and put under pressure eventually and formed coal and oil. And I've always wondered, well, what would happen if there hadn't been quite so wet at that point? During the Carboniferous, and all that wood never got buried. How would that have affected Earth's history?
I like that as a counterfactual. You know, a lot of the like coals, the Carboniferous coals and things like that originated then, but there's been like petroleum, there's been, you know, Miocene sediments offshore California, like the drilling that occurs offshore of LA and things like that. They're recovering Miocene and Eocene and oils and things like that. So it's not the only time, at least, that fossil fuels have been buried, although it was that, or the development of land plants and the swamps that could kind of preserve those materials was a major event, and it actually led to an ice age at that time, right? We started burning a lot of carbon for a little while. But I don't know, it would be a great story to write, and it'd be interesting to think about what that would mean in terms of human
So it wouldn't
civilization.
be human-induced climate change. It might not be human.
There might not be humans, and there would, well, I mean, we really only started using fossil fuels as an energy source about 1950, so, you know, biomass burning before that, it wouldn't have led to the population growth and things like that we are supported by fossil fuels today, I think.
Yeah, so what I'm thinking about is the very first series of graphs that you showed, and there is a period in which human population increases rather before the fossil fuel age altogether, right? And that seems to chart with your CO2. So to what extent is there a background feature in which human population is one of the things that gets us lifted?
That's a great question. So there's fisticuffs at meetings over the early influence of humans on atmospheric CO2. And so what you picked out, that kind of rise before the Industrial Revolution, before we really started using fossil fuels. So, and you see the same thing in methane and other greenhouse gases as well, that people think are linked to like potentially human activity. So the big like onset of farming and rice agriculture and things like that could have changed. It started to add CO2 and methane and other greenhouse gases earlier than the Industrial Revolution. And so there's also counter arguments to that. And so there's no clear answer at this point from the record, but it sure looks suspiciously like there might have been human influence earlier than you know, the Industrial Revolution. Nothing on the scale that we're seeing, but it would, to your counterfactual story, it still would have been a factor in Earth's climate that would lead to some warming and some changes.
So anyone who's been to Papua New Guinea knows that every year people go out and burn huge areas of grassland, grow like crazy. I'm sure that has a big thing.
I'm curious about one thing. I understand the importance of studying the ice cores to, you know, find the atmospheric bubbles. How do they date the ice cores?
A couple ways. One, just use the physics of ice and ice flow. So you can actually calculate how the ice has been flowing and getting, you know, compressed and things like that. And you can actually see annual layers in the ice cores for a long period. So you can actually calibrate these models, these flow models, because you can see the compression and the flow of those layers, but they get so thin towards the bottom that it's pretty hard to do. And so the other way that they're dated is actually by correlating the oxygen isotope, so the 18 to 16 in O2 oxygen that's in the ice cores, because it turns out the oceans are the dog on that isotope system. The ocean respiration and seawater itself controls the isotope composition of oxygen in the atmosphere and thus in the bubble. So you can correlate the two and date the ocean sediments themselves.
Maybe one or two more questions. Okay,
Okay, how far out do you have to go in the ship to reach an appropriate seabed level? Can you do it like, you know, half mile out?
So we need to go to usually kind of far offshore, so middle of the ocean, so like the Western Equatorial Pacific or far North Atlantic or things like that. You want to be out in the deep ocean basin where the sediments are kind of accumulating and they're not subject to the processes that occur on the continental slope. Like, so that would be pretty close shore here. And you don't want to be on the continental shelf, the really shallow part, because that was actually not seawater, that was air 18,000 years ago when ice sheets grew and took a lot of water out of the ocean. So the shoreline here would have been off, right at the shelf slope break. So you want to go far off into the deep ocean. And there's a long history at UCSC of this kind of ocean exploration and drilling. So Christina Ravello, Andy Fisher in Earth and Planetary Sciences, and Jim Zakos, I'm probably forgetting a few others who have been deeply involved with this program as I am now today.
And do you get a lot of difference, like from the northern part, southern part, middle part, whatever?
Yeah, so there's different questions that people ask. So if you want, like there's a whole group of scientists that are interested in the history of these ice sheets, and so they go and drill close to Antarctica or Greenland, and they can look for clues of the ice sheets and the icebergs that would have rafted sediments out to the drill core location, things like that. There's others that are interested in studying El Nino and the El Nino Southern Oscillation. So I've actually done some of that with Christina, where we go look at sediment cores that were taken, along the equator in the Pacific Ocean. So there's kind of a whole, like, Polissar was just interested in all of the geologic history that can tell us about these processes that are kind of chaotic and difficult to understand on a really short observational time period that we have.
Hey, one more, yeah.
This may be getting into too much detail, recent detail, but I was curious about the medieval warming and the little ice ages, and if you have a view on their origin.
It's been a while. I cut my teeth as a young paleoclimatologist on those time periods. So there's referring to time periods over the last 1,000 years where we had kind of slightly warmer period, maybe in the 1300s, and colder periods, kind of 1600s. I moved to these longer time scales in part because they just seem to be less relevant in terms of our future. And so it seems more difficult to learn about what our future is, both by looking at colder time periods and by looking at time periods where it's just really small changes in climate or CO2, whereas we're just headed towards such larger changes that those are almost irrelevant. My understanding is it still ought to be related to solar output and solar sunspot number, things like that. Although there has to be some pretty complicated things going on to actually see the response that we see in climate compared to the changes that we think would have happened with the sun.
Stop it, but Todd, if you have a short question.
Has there been any calculation to look at what the CO2 calculation in concentration would be if we achieved net zero?
So the question is, what happens to CO2 concentrations when we achieve net zero? And net zero means that there's no net CO2 emissions. That means we emit CO2, but then we actually have to pull it out of the atmosphere. There have to be negative emissions to offset that. And one of the revolutions that's occurred in the thinking on this has occurred over my academic career, and that is, it was thought for a long time that there would be a lot of warming in the pipeline, they called it, that even if we brought CO2 emissions to zero right now, we would see temperature continue to climb over decades. Those studies and those models that were used for that weren't properly taking into account the exchange of carbon dioxide with the oceans and kind of a complicated set of things that happen that turn out to actually balance in a way that if we go to net zero right now, we actually stop the warming right now. And so it's not something that happens in decades, it's something that happens right now. And so when I teach really engaged kids here at UCSC on this topic, that's one of the few things I can point to as hopeful. The other thing is what's happened to the cost and the use of renewables, which are zero emission, at least in terms of electricity generation, energy generation. Other than that, it's really hard to find bright points in this story, right? But those are huge bright points. And so net zero, if we get to net zero, we actually stop warming. And so the warming today is due to the accumulated CO2, so the emissions of CO2 to date, and any future warming is due to future emissions. And so it's a much more direct relationship and which I think is consequential for people's motivations for making change. And then the rapidity with which we're seeing kind of transformation of energy generation is heartening, and that's without government regulations, and that's a whole other topic, right? But that's just with kind of some R&D and some, and economics. And so what if we actually made that a policy?
Great, thank you. Hey,